Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Big Data, Big Issues. I'm your host, Sheldon Kreger, and today we will be continuing our conversation about surveillance capitalism. If you did not hear part one of this series, please visit bigdatabigissues.com, and you can find the first episode about surveillance capitalism there. Today, we're going to be focusing on a topic of Shoshana Zuboff's book, which I'll go into. The topic is the unprecedented rise of corporate power. And we'll be exploring how the expansion of surveillance techniques by large corporations has had the consequence of vastly expanding their power in ways that we've never seen before. This whole presentation, this whole conversation is really based on the book by Shoshana Zuboff, as introduced in part one. It's called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, the fight for a human future at the new frontier of power. And it was published in 2019. You can find it on Audible, or you can purchase a hard copy or get it from your library. This conversation is just scratching the tip of the iceberg. Even if you listen to every podcast in the series, I'm only going to be scratching the surface of this book because it's over 700 pages long, and it represents 7 years of focused work by Shoshana Zuboff. Zuboff, speaking of which, has a PhD in social psychology from Harvard. She studied briefly, at least, under B.F. Skinner, and in 1981 she became the Charles Edward Wilson Professor of Business Administration and one of the first tenured women on the Harvard Business School faculty. And if you'd like to know more about the book, there's a more lengthy introduction in part one of this series. Today's conversation is best introduced by a quote from her book. Surveillance capitalism is a puppet master that imposes its will through the medium of ubiquitous digital apparatus. I now name the apparatus Big Other. It is the sensate, computational, connected puppet that renders, monitors, computes, and modifies human behavior. Big Other combines these functions of knowing and doing to achieve a pervasive and unprecedented means of behavioral modification, replacing the engineering of souls with the engineering of behavior. Now, I know there's some specialized terminology that may be difficult to comprehend without the full context of Zuboff's book, but I wanted to open up with the big picture coming for about halfway through Zuboff's book, in fact, and we'll be diving into the details of all this today. I want to first look at the profitability of behavioral profiling today. Corporations are now very active in the space of collecting behavioral data and using this for profitability, and this is a key part of Zuboff's book. Some examples include companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, IBM, Microsoft, all of which are using massive data sets of behavioral data to make predictions about what their consumers might do in the future, and then use that data to help them persuade those consumers to buy their products or engage with their products or perform some other task or operation that kind of benefits the corporation. It was really Google that brought to power the age of digital surveillance and brought it into the marketplace. For example, they have $136.22 billion of revenue in 2018, and about 116 billion of that comes from their ad revenue, which is the Google ad platform was really the pilot project for this entire expansion of capitalism into the surveillance marketplace. What Google did early on was they allowed companies to advertise on their search platform by specifying which keywords are your consumers looking for. You know, when your customers go to Google and they search for some keyword, a company could say, I want to bid on that keyword to have my ad placed at the top of the page. And what Google did was a radical new approach where instead of allowing the companies to particularly choose which keywords to promote in their ad campaigns, they forced them to just throw out a general revenue amount or a general marketing budget amount and allow Google to control where their ads were being placed. And they were able to do this by taking behavioral data from the users who were using the search engine. So for example, when I search on Google for a particular term and then I click on a specific page, Google is aware of which page I click on. In fact, Google is actually trying to use my phone right now. No, Google, please stop. I put it on do not disturb mode, and as you can see, it still is listening to my voice. But anyways, when I click on a search result in Google, it can keep track of how long I'm on, which link I click on, how long I'm on the page, what information I read there. It can analyze the metadata of the content of the page, as well as the contents of the page itself, if the website is kind of opted into that service, which most do. And then they turned this into a giant surveillance and analysis platform and meshed it into their marketing stream so that this allowed them to fully automate the way that our ads are targeted to particular users on the platform. And this was kind of the very first pilot project, Zuboff points out in the book, of like this surveillance capitalism rise to power. And since then, different kinds of activities have become incentivized for consumers to hand over this behavioral data so that corporations can build these platforms and exert their influence and expand their profitability. For example, Facebook was really the first to incentivize consumers to voluntarily deliver behavioral data and personal information. For example, all of your Facebook posts, your friend network, your profile data like your age, your personal photos, all of that data, Facebook incentivized you or us to hand that over to them voluntarily, and then they use this to build one of the most powerful advertising platforms in the entire world, with $55.8 billion in revenue in 2018. And these corporations, these are just two examples, obviously, but this is a process that's ongoing all over the world now, and there are many companies involved with this, and it's really expanding at a tremendous rate. Furthermore, these companies are continuously investing in research and development to expand the kind of data that we hand over and to incentivize us to engage more with their platforms so that they can create better predictions for the people who are using their marketing platforms. And this is an example of, for those of you who are watching the YouTube video anyways, you can see this chart of Google ad revenue from 2001 to 2018, being about, I want to say that's $70 million in 2001, all the way up to $116.32 billion in 2018, through a refinement of this program and through an expansion of the kinds of data that they're collecting, not just the way you interact with their search engine, but the way that you interact with your products, or like my phone was doing just a minute ago, listening to your conversations and so on. Zuboff, one of the things I really love about the Zuboff books, and what really makes me appreciate the originality of her work, is the way that she laid down the mechanics of this process. And the way she explains it is in terms of imperatives, of economic imperatives that surveillance capitalists are subject to. First of all, products are engineered to collect user data via the extraction imperative. Behavioral data then is traded between organizations and conglomerated via the consolidation imperative. And then data is analyzed to infer future user behavior via the prediction imperative. And then, of course, these predictions are later sold as behavioral futures. And it is these behavioral futures that kind of are the end product and allow the company to build products like targeted ads and things like that. But it's interesting that this process can be broken down, and I just think it's very brilliant the way that she did that. Zuboff says that thanks to the big other's capabilities, instrumentarian power reduces human experience to measurable, observable behavior while remaining steadfastly indifferent to the meaning of that experience. I call this new way of knowing radical indifference. Radical indifference is another key concept of surveillance capitalism, both the book and the topic. And Zuboff explains that individuals are categorized today based on behavioral data by these companies. And these categorizations have value only in the context of their exploitability, how much profit can be generated based off this kind of categorization of you as a person, of you as a consumer into a specific group. How much value does that bring? And this process, what it does is it reduces individuals to what she calls organisms among organisms. And it fundamentally ignores the ways in which we differ. And it's interesting to think about this because although the process is highly personalized, targeted ads are fundamentally highly personalized. It makes it feel like you are being treated as a unique individual, and all of the aspects of your personality, they're really trying to take as many aspects of your personality into account when they create these behavioral futures and they put you into categories with other consumers. However, the process itself has no context about who you are as a person in a total sense. It's really isolated to specific traits that are determined to be either effective or ineffective in the context of generating capital. And it erases all of the other aspects of your identity that are not relevant to the production of profit. And so what this means is that it ignores a lot of the very important contextual information and culturally relevant information about people that is really key to their personalities. And this is a form of just the breakdown of identity and the relationship between individuals and agents and corporations in society, is this radical indifference process. I'm going to go through a few examples because this is all very theoretical, but I want to go through a few examples of the imperatives of surveillance capitalism in action and this full chain of collecting information and creating a prediction about your behavior and then trying to exploit that. The easiest example for us in the United States is health insurance, because as we all know, when a person is considered at a higher risk for getting sick, they pay more money for their health insurance. And this is already a very problematic way to conduct healthcare for obvious reasons, but that's the way things work now. And the rise of surveillance capitalism has allowed this form of exploitation to really grasp its fist even tighter around the people. For example, me personally, under my new healthcare plan through my employer, all due respect to them, and obviously my opinions don't reflect theirs, but under the health plan that I have to opt into through my employer, I have to hand deliver biometric data to the insurance company through a health and wellness program, is what they call it. And this ensures that I get a regular checkup, and maybe I provide some information about the kinds of food I eat, or how much exercise I get, or how often I get sick. I don't really know what they're going to ask me for, because I've never opted into something like this before. But if I don't hand this data over to them, then next year in 2021, my rate will go up substantially. They basically treat me as a risky individual that they'd rather not insure, and they just rather charge me more money just because I haven't given them that data. So that's like a situation where the agency has direct control to manipulate the individual into handing over personal data, and then using that to make some kind of prediction about how healthy they're going to be, and then change their health insurance rate based on that data. However, this process doesn't just happen through people handing over their data, supposedly voluntarily, if you can even call it that. They also take into account your insurance claims. So any kinds of claims I made on my insurance, any doctor's visit I had, they know all that information. My age, where I live, my race, and any other kind of biometric data they can get their hands on through corporate partnerships with other companies that have behavioral data. And for example, I don't know if this is actually happening, I'm just kind of making this up, but for example, a company like Fitbit, they might work with a data broker to sell their data that they collect about their customers and sell that to insurance companies. And then the insurance companies can use this data to profile their potential customers and adjust their insurance rates accordingly. So through the extraction imperative, the corporations, the insurance company conglomerates all this information about people, and then through the prediction imperative, they determine what kind of health outcomes they're likely to have in the next year, so that they can create the behavioral future, which is the price of the individual's insurance policy. And that is all very mathematically driven, and very data driven, and very mathematically driven. And they're taking a gamble. They're saying they think that their models are accurate, and they're thinking that they can use that information to create an accurate picture and take a risk on how much money they're going to charge somebody based on how sick they're going to be. It's pretty interesting. Another example would be personalized ads. And through the extraction imperative, companies collect information like our web history, the way that we data from interacting with apps on our phones, geolocation information from our phones, publicly available information, or maybe information that we've handed over to corporations like our age and our gender, as well as purchase histories from our credit card companies and from our banks. And then they use this to, through the prediction imperative, decide what kinds of ads to deliver to us on our phones, on our web browsers, even on our televisions. And what they can do is they can say, Sheldon is a user who has this kind of web history. They use this kind of app, and he's this age, and he bought this particular item. So I also know that there's a similar user to Sheldon who bought some other related item, and I'm going to give ads to Sheldon that are for that item where there might be mutual interest. So the kind of a similarity calculation is the behavioral future in this scenario. In addition, this might not just be targeted ads for selling products. It's important to realize that this kind of targeting can happen for, one of the funny ones that came up actually under the Mark Zuckerberg's questioning in Congress a couple weeks ago was that Facebook had been in trouble for allowing advertisers to target users with using the Facebook's ad platform for real estate real estate ads, and this actually it was legally found to be amounting to redlining because they were able to use racial data to determine who received ads in which neighborhoods, thereby breaking the law. And this can also happen with job research results. If someone's searching for a job, then the ads can be custom tailored to the person who is searching based on their perceived capability to do that job, based on the data that they've extracted previously from that user and other users. So there are many ramifications of this just beyond personalized ads. And we're even seeing this kind of system pop up in job interviews with behavioral profiling of the applicants and stuff. But I'm not going to go into that at the moment. What this really amounts to, though, is that there are unprecedented boundaries that are just expanding and expanding today. And I think that this is summarized, the end goal of the boundaries, what's the limit? Where do we kind of draw the line on how much data is being handed over what kind of analysis can be done, what kind of assumptions can be made about people? Where's the limit here? And I think that the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, pardon me if I pronounced that incorrectly, but I think that they summarized things really well when they introduced the Microsoft's personal assistant tool called Cortana at the Ignite conference in 2016. Here's what they said. This new category of the personal digital assistant is a runtime, a new interface. It can take text input. It can take speech input. It knows you deeply. It knows your context, your family, your work. It knows the world. It is unbounded. In other words, it's about you. It's not about any one device. And I think it's very revealing to be able to find a quote like this, a public quote from a conference from the CEO of one of the most powerful corporations in the world, explaining, literally stating that this kind of technology is meant to be unbounded in nature. And this is sort of the imperative of capitalism itself, Zuboff explains. The unbounded drive for the creation of profit and generating revenue, coupled with this surveillance technology, just necessitates an unbounded expansion absent some kind of intervention. So we've looked at the expansion of corporate capabilities for behavioral profiling and the collection of personal data. But now I want to look into how this affects our public lives. How does this affect us as individuals, for example? And what's happened is there has been a blurring of what we intend to have be our public life versus what we intend to have be our private life, because it's been discovered by these corporations that they can take data that we intend to have publicly available and use that to make inferences about our personality that we intend to keep private to ourselves. So through the extraction imperative, corporations collect information. In this example, this is on Facebook, and actually this comes from a National Academy of Sciences study in 2013 called Private Traits and Attributes Are Predictable from Digital Records of Human Behavior. And in this study, what they found is that through the extraction imperative on Facebook, they were able to gather likes, shares, comments, posts, all that kind of information, and use this through the prediction imperative to create behavioral futures about a person's private life. So the likes, shares, comments, posts, that kind of thing are all public on Facebook, at least to our friends, we hope. That's kind of the intention there. But the researchers found that they're actually able to turn this into a behavioral future and make very accurate predictions about things that we intend to keep private, such as our sexual orientation, ethnicity, our political views, our personality traits, our level of intelligence, our level of happiness, or our likelihood of being psychologically unhappy, any analysis on whether or not we're abusing substances or drugs or alcohol, and even whether our parents were separated while we were kids. This kind of granular prediction is absolutely shocking. And I don't think that there is enough conversation going on among data professionals and among the public in general about this particular capability of taking public information and then making very accurate inferences about things that we intend to keep to ourselves. In addition to the blurring of public life and private life in the corporate sense, we also have the blurring of corporate entities and state entities today. And this is because due to the profitability of this process, corporations have been interfering with the political process in order to expand their power and to continue to abide by these imperatives and to continue the expansion of their data sets and their profitability. For example, privacy policies today, Zuboff actually calls them surveillance policies because it's a more accurate term, I believe, she believes, and I also believe, for the relationship between the corporation and the person. And these are widely ignored when somebody agrees to one. Almost nobody reads them. This is widely understood. There's open academic research on how poorly consumers understand the surveillance policies. And even when they're not ignored, they're very lengthy and difficult to read. But they are legally binding, and they can be updated at any point in the future, often without consent from the individual, just by notifying them, hey, we updated our privacy policy and now we're expanding our rights to your personal data even further. And it becomes difficult for people to track the kinds of changes that are being made. And with all the different accounts that they've signed up for, or maybe with email addresses they don't use anymore, stuff like that, it's really impossible for people to keep track of what kind of surveillance they've agreed to be a part of these days. I think that's a big legal problem, but it's legally binding. And this is kind of an overlap between corporate authority and state authority being able to uphold these privacy policies. It's pretty interesting to me. Another overlap of corporate and state entities today in this context is with privacy regulation itself. Recently, thankfully, there's been an increased interest by the public for privacy regulation. We had the GDPR pass in the European Union, taking some important steps. And we've had more attempts here in the United States at the state level. For example, California passed a major piece of legislation. Other states have mostly failed, including Washington. I have episodes on the show about the Washington Privacy Act if you're interested. But what's important to know is that these public efforts to create some kind of regulation are largely subject to corporate influence, just like kind of everything else in America. I can't speak to the way things work in other countries, but in America, corporate influence over public policy is a huge problem. And for example, I can't go into a whole lot of examples in detail here, but one example is that Facebook has turned back facial recognition regulation in Montana, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Alaska, and Washington. And this is in 2019. I'm reporting this. This was in the Zuboff's book. She mentioned this. And then complementary to that, Facebook also spent $4.5 million on donations to political campaigns in 2016. and an additional $11.5 million on lobbying in 2017. So it's very clear that corporations like Facebook and others are incentivizing politicians not to regulate their industry and to keep things relatively hands-off so that they continue to abide by these imperatives of surveillance capitalism. One of the fundamental questions here is consent. When we talk about legal, the right for a corporation to collect your behavioral data, one of the key things that we talk about is consent. And in the Washington Privacy Act, again, there's a whole episode on this, but in the Act of 2019, which failed to pass, the precedent for consent was this: controllers must gain consent from consumers prior to deploying facial recognition services in physical premises open to the public. The placement of conspicuous notice in physical premises that clearly conveys that facial recognition services are being used constitute a consumer's consent. Now, this is highly problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, the idea that consent has been given as soon as I read a sign in a public space saying that I've given consent, I find that to be extremely uncompelling. And I think that this particular section of the bill was one of the major reasons why it failed to pass, because it was essentially laying down like a red carpet to have facial recognition technology deployed all over Washington and elsewhere by whatever corporations wanted to do so. Second of all, even if there was a way to have legitimate consent for facial recognition technology, there's no easy way for someone to reverse their consent, because you can't leave your face at home. There's no way for you to, in a particular situation where you're uncomfortable with the way facial recognition is being used, in that moment, there's no way for you to opt out of that. So it's really important to have a very clear and enforceable and easily modifiable form of consent, especially in the context of facial recognition software. And the last thing is, if there was a widespread adoption of facial recognition services across the state of Washington or the United States or the world, and I wanted to opt out of that, it may be that I have no alternatives for the services that choose not to use facial recognition software. For example, if all of the grocery stores in my neighborhood are using facial recognition software within their stores for counter theft technology or for consumer profiling like we talked about before, sure, I could opt out of that by not shopping at their store. But if every store in my neighborhood is doing that, then I don't really have much of a choice. It's really a false choice. And those kinds of choices, I believe, affect people who are poor to a greater degree. They affect people, minorities to a greater degree. And having the economic ability and having the time to understand these policies, these consent policies and these surveillance policies, and figuring out why you need to opt out, all this kind of stuff is representative of a high level of privilege. And people who don't have that kind of privilege, they're fundamentally going to be exploited if consent is not defined in a friendly way. Moving on from the problem of facial recognition technology and the problem of consent in general, there are other areas where there's a blurring of corporate and state authority. For example, it looks like I've got something out of order here, so one moment, bear with me. In elections, in political elections, behavioral data is gold. What political campaigns do today, the smart ones, is they take the budget that they used to spend on 30-second commercials on TV networks and they purchase data about potential voters, and then they hire data scientists and data analysts and software engineers to build platforms where they can identify people who are likely to vote for them and who are likely to donate to their political campaigns. And the way that this process works is through the extraction imperative. The political campaign collects public records, social media data, purchase histories, and other socioeconomic data. And they create, through the prediction imperatives, behavioral futures in the categories of a user who's likely to donate to a campaign if they see an ad, or a user who's likely to become a voter if they see an ad. So they try and understand a person's political leanings and their voter history, and then they say, well, we don't want to spend our money advertising to people who are already going to vote for us, and we don't want to spend our money advertising to people who there's no way in hell they're going to vote for us. But what we want to do is we want to spend our money on people who would vote for us if we gave them some kind of cue. If we show them an ad, then it kind of it nudges them over the line to actually show up on election day and go vote, or it pushes them over the line to give us a donation to our campaign. And this whole process is deeply detailed in a presentation that I found from the Data Council San Francisco in 2019. The presentation is called How Data is Transforming Politics, and it was given by Catherine Tarsney, who's the analytics director at the Democratic National Committee. So this is literally the director of analytics at one of the largest political organizations in the country, explaining how they win elections by using the extraction imperative and the prediction imperative to create behavioral futures. And I highly encourage you to check out that video. Extremely insightful, extremely inspiring, and just the amount of, it really opens the eyes to the amount of power that is held in this process. And I do want to add, there's no doubt in my mind that this is a legitimate use of this kind of technology. I highly believe in the legitimacy of using behavioral data to run political campaigns more effectively. I think that this is a great thing. But what I'm trying to explain here is that this process itself, it is a very powerful thing, and it does create a blurring of the line between corporate entities and public entities, between the state and between corporations. And I also want to emphasize that although in this case, campaigns using this kind of data to conduct their political campaigns using this data to conduct effective political campaigns, even though that is a legitimate use of this kind of thing, there are very illegitimate uses of this kind of system. For example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal of 2016, where it was found that this corporation was creating these campaigns for a Russian operative. And of course, I have another episode on this show all about the Internet Research Agency in Russia and the way that they influenced the 2016 election and continue to do so. And it's through this exact process. So it's important to understand that there are legitimate uses for this kind of technology, but then there are very unethical and problematic and just terrible uses of this technology as well. There are a couple other ways that a corporation can have influence over public policy because of the data that they've gained, the data that they have. For example, and I'm not saying that this happens. I have no evidence that this happens in the United States, but in other countries, maybe this is a lot easier to do, or maybe this is happening behind the scenes and we just don't know yet. But blackmailing is a big problem. Let's say a corporation holds some kind of sensitive personal data about a politician. They've been having an affair. They can run some kind of analysis on their Facebook data or their Twitter data or whatever, and they can see that there's a very strong connection between a politician and someone that they're having an affair with, and they can identify that person. They can use that kind of information to exploit the politician and blackmail them so that they will influence, so that they'll pass policies that favor the political outcomes that the corporation wants to have. And I just see this as like a huge area of potential abuse that thankfully I haven't seen anything in the news about this happening yet, but I'm almost certain that this will happen at some point. And it's also worth mentioning that this is the main reason that we have, when working with sensitive data in the government, this is why we have background checks and security clearances, is because they want to screen people out if they're at high risk of being blackmailed. A lot of the questions for people who are applying for security clearances, and this is public data, is they're trying to figure out, is there dirt on you that somebody could pick up? And then they could use that to blackmail you so that you will steal data from the United States and deliver it to a foreign agent. This is something that is of high concern in the government sphere, but this kind of blackmailing process, I think, is a huge risk for corporations here in the United States. And the last thing, these social media companies and these big corporations, they have a tremendous amount of influence over the kind of publicity that politicians and campaigns get. And this is like a huge source of debate right now. For example, Twitter has said that they're not actually going to allow any advertising for political campaigns on their platform at all. And Facebook, on the other hand, is saying we're going to let politicians say literally whatever they want. We're not going to do any kind of filtering based on what they're saying is a lie or whether it's true. And regardless of kind of what you think of those specific policies, what I want to convey to you is that these digital platforms hold a tremendous amount of power over the way campaigns, the amount of exposure that campaigns get in the first place. In addition, it's possible that these corporations could deliver very detailed user data over to these political campaigns on a selective basis in order to favor one candidate or another. So, for example, they could give voter information over to the Republican Party and not the Democratic Party, or vice versa. And I'm not saying that has happened, but I'm saying it is a risk. And finally, they could just outright deny somebody the ability to use their platform at all. And that would be a huge problem. There's been a lot of calls, for example, to ban Donald Trump from Twitter, and that would have a lot of ramifications politically. And I'm not going to dive into my personal opinions on whether they should or shouldn't. It's not really relevant to the conversation right now. But regardless of what you think they should do, the fact that they have that power is what I'm trying to attract, where I'm trying to draw our attention today. Finally, and I know we've been going on for a while now, but this is the final area that I'm going to discuss, the blurring of corporate and state authority today. And this is corporate cooperation with intelligence operations in the United States. So for those of you who don't know, which I'm sure everyone's well aware, but back in 2013, there was a giant leak of highly classified information from various government agencies from a gentleman named Edward Snowden, whose opinion is too complex for me to discuss at the moment, but essentially handed over all these documents to journalists detailing a lot of spying operations that were happening from the NSA and the CIA and the FBI, and the way that they were working with corporate entities in order to gather highly detailed information about the users of those corporate products and how then they use this for their intelligence purposes. And this all kind of originates, this all came out in 2013, but there's been more recent revelations. I'm not going to dive into too many of those today. But the root of all this stems from a particular piece of legislation called FISA. And, oh goodness, I can't remember what it stands for off the top of my head, but there's a particular section called FISA 702, and it mandates that corporations cooperate with federal investigators in their operations, and furthermore that they cannot tell the public that they've been forced to cooperate. So if the FBI needs to contact Google to get some data out of my Gmail account, then they have to cooperate with the FBI, and they don't notify me and they don't notify the public that they're doing so. And the current legal precedent is that for domestic surveillance, there has to be a special warrant issued by a court that was set up actually by under FISA. There's a special court that the intelligence community works with, and they get warrants for their investigations of domestic targets. So people in the United States, people who are U.S. citizens, there has to be warrants to do that kind of spying. However, there's also a legal precedent in FISA 702 or in FISA, I'm not sure which section. Apologize for that, but that foreign targets of spying are actually fair game of spying without any kind of warrant whatsoever. So there's a bulk collection of information about foreign targets, and this is used for very important and legitimate intelligence operations, I want to state. And they're able to use this for counterterrorism, for taking down criminal activity online, like credit card fraud. They're able to do all kinds of really important operations with this kind of data. But it's just interesting to note that for foreign targets, there's no need for a warrant, but for domestic targets, there are. And the further complication here is that if a foreign target is contacting a domestic target, then the domestic target is kind of de facto roped into the investigation, and there's no longer any need to get a warrant to investigate that domestic target. And in fact, it kind of just opens the doors for any kind of investigation to proceed against that target. So let's say somebody who is a suspected foreign terrorist calls a person in the United States, and the intelligence community intercepts that information. They then identify that domestic target as somebody that they're going to investigate, and they can just kind of do whatever they want from there. So that's really interesting. And I think personally, it's really important to have clear standards around this kind of stuff. Whether I agree 100% with these like legal precedents or not, I haven't decided, but I do just want to point out that this is a very big blur of corporate and state authority, because most of this communications data is handed over to the NSA or the FBI or whoever by corporations that are actually managing the telecommunications projects. And one thing I will say is that the lack of transparency in this area, I think, has backfired on the intelligence community. And I think that it has made the public very distrustful of the intelligence community, and has served to, in the public sphere, delegitimize the intelligence community. And I'm afraid that it could end in legislation that affects the IC's ability to conduct operations in the future, and it could end in a catastrophe. So not having transparency on these corporate partnerships and the kind of surveillance that's being conducted, I personally think, and it's not often I take a stand on these, as you may have noticed, but this is an area where I have a really strong opinion that increased transparency on these operations and having clear standards set is extremely important. One of the abuses that's said to be ongoing today. At least there's been an accusation by a whistleblower. I found an article from The Intercept called "The NSA's Hidden Spy Hubs in 8 U.S. cities." So this is after the Snowden documents came out in 2013. This is another whistleblower who said the data is routed in whole or in part through the 8 AT&T buildings where the NSA taps into it. By monitoring what it calls the peering circuits at the 8 sites, the spy agency can collect not only AT&T's data, they get all the data that's interchanged between AT&T's network and other companies, according to Mark Klein, a former AT&T technician who worked with the company for 22 years. It is an efficient point to conduct internet surveillance, Klein said, because the peering links, by the nature of the connections, are liable to carry everybody's traffic at one point or another during the day, week, or the year. So this particular whistleblower has kind of revealed, you can look up the article on The Intercept. There'll be a link on bigdatabig-issues.com on this episode. But it's an interesting read. What this whistleblower is kind of accusing AT&T and the NSA of doing is setting up these bulk collection operations at the actual physical interceptions of internet cables that run between different countries and different continents and into the United States. And it's saying that because AT&T is participating on one of those intercepts, it actually allows the NSA to gather data from all companies that are operating on that infrastructure. So even for corporations who want to object, even if they had a way legally to object to doing this, the NSA supposedly has found this very clever way of circumventing those kinds of defenses, and by working with very powerful companies who have access to data at a very raw level, and therefore allowing them to collect things from other companies that they're not even necessarily working with. So it's just a very interesting precedent to be set, and I wanted to point that one out as well. Finally, to wrap this up, I'm going to talk about what will be the topic of a future episode about surveillance capitalism, which is instrumentarian power. And this is a core concept in Zuboff's book, and I believe will prove to be the most controversial subject in the Zuboff book, is this concept of instrumentarianism. Because what Zuboff says is that this new form of power, where corporations collect behavioral data and use that to manipulate consumers into doing what they want them to, she argues that this is a new form of power that is on the same scope of influence as totalitarianism was. And she spends a few pages or maybe even a chapter discussing the differences between instrumentarianism and totalitarianism and drawing a comparison between the two. Instrumentarianism is something that Zuboff argues there's an agenda for behavioral manipulation on behalf of these corporations. And she'll go on to argue in the book that it's not just about expanded profit seeking, but it is actually to create a more ideal society. And this is something that we'll dive into another episode. But I just want to kind of introduce this distinction between instrumentarian and totalitarianism here. Instrumentarianism is indifferent to political ideology, but totalitarianism actually aims to win the hearts and minds of its subjects through rhetoric. So a totalitarian leader will try and convince people to join their cause through their speeches and so on, while instrumentarians will actually, they don't really need anyone to join because they actually operate covertly through manipulative techniques. In contrast, totalitarians operated through intimidation and violence and through rhetoric. But instrumentarianisms, thankfully, they've there's no need for violence or intimidation because they create other incentives for people to hand over their data and then use this to manipulate them to their needs. And finally, the goal of instrumentarianism is to modify individual behavior and to generate more revenue for the companies. And Zuboff argues it goes beyond that, but we're not going to dive into that here. But on the other hand, totalitarianism has the goal of modifying user behavior to expand power. So they're really trying to convince people to join them, threatening if they don't, intimidating them, risk of violence, and trying to expand their territory, expand their base of power. And through the instrumentarian mode of power, those things just aren't necessary because they have used psychological techniques combined with modern technology in order to create a more covert form of power, but is equally powerful, is what Zuboff argues. So, in summary, surveillance capitalism's imperatives are the extraction and analysis of behavioral data with the goal to develop highly confident behavioral futures. And this process has proven to be extremely profitable, and it's resulted in the blurring of private and public life through behavioral profiling and classification, and the inference of private personal information from public data. It's also created a blurring of corporate and state authority through cooperation with intelligence operations and through the influence of political campaigns and elections. And once again, I would encourage you to pick up Zuboff's book. It's called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. You can find it on Audible. You can check it out at your library or pick it up hard copy wherever you like to buy books. But I've only scratched the surface here. And I'm just very thankful for everyone who joined today. And thank you so much for your time. The best way to support this podcast is to like and leave comments, as well as share the episode with your friends and colleagues. You can find detailed notes, reading suggestions, and a complete episode list at bigdatabigissues.com.